Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good Thursday evening. And I just wanted to share a devotional message with you tonight. Appreciate Jim and Barrett who have been doing some messages throughout the week, and I hope you've had the chance to check those out. If not, they're on our Facebook page. They're also on our YouTube page. So please check out what both those guys have. And just another reminder that we have our Wana Jeopardy questions were posted yesterday. And for the first Awana Clubber and for the first leader who answers all of those questions, we're going to have a reward for them at the beginning of the Awana year next year, which hopefully we'll be able to have an Awana year next year. We're certainly planning on it, but we'll see what happens. But I've been reading through the book of Psalms. I always read a psalm a day. And one struck me today, and I wanted to share that with you. It's from Psalm 112, and in verse 7, actually, back up, we'll start in verse 6. It says, "For the righteous will never be moved, he will be remembered forever. He is not afraid of bad news, his heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. His heart is steady. He will not be afraid until he looks in triumph on his adversaries." So, there in verse 6, the psalmist here tells us that he's talking of the righteous. So, God's people, those who are in right standing with the Lord. So, if our faith and trust is in Jesus and we're walking in His Spirit, that's us. We're the righteous. And so he says, the righteous won't be moved. And I love verse 7. He says, he's not afraid of bad news. Now, certainly we've been getting a significant amount of bad news in 2020. And it's easy to be overcome by fear. The last devotional I did, I talked about that fear again, that it's easy to be filled with fear, to be filled with anxiety. I had to go to my doctor yesterday, and I was talking to her, and she was telling me how many people that she's seen come in since all this started who really are there for anxiety. They may have other issues that have been plaguing them, but that a lot of those issues are being brought upon by fear and by anxiety. And for us as believers, if you are a believer, we we shouldn't be that way. And Psalm 112 and a couple other places we're going to look at tells us why we shouldn't be overcome by anxiety, but instead should be strengthened by our faith in Jesus. So, Psalm 112, he's not afraid of bad news. Well, okay, in verse 7, why is he not afraid of bad news? Because his heart is firm. And that word for firm, think of like unshakable. The Hebrew word is nakan, and it's something that's unshakable. It's not moved. It's firm, and the reason his heart is firm is the next part of verse 7, because he's trusting in the Lord. And what I love is verse 8 even begins to unpack that more, that this firmness of heart comes from trusting in the Lord. And verse 8 says his heart is steady. And you might think firm and steady are, kind of the same word, but it's two different Hebrew words here. So the word for steady is samuk, which means it's being supported. As when I think of something that's being supported, you have walls that are supported, you have support beams and things like that. And funny story, when I think of support, I went to Taylor basketball camp every summer for quite a few summers, and was one of the few fat kids at basketball camp. And every year they would do this big tug of war, which was involved in a lot of games on the last night. But the big game for that night, for some reason, was tug of war. And as the one fat kid in the group, I was always chosen to be the anchor of whatever team I was on. So, the anchor is the one who's trying to give support for the rest of the team. So I was, based on my size and strength, I was the anchor. I was the support for the tug of war team. And I will say that I think my team only lost one time in our tug of war. So I, got that going for me. But here, when it says his heart is steady, well, his heart is steady because the support to cause his heart to be steady is the Lord. The Lord is the anchor for our hearts when we trust in him. He's the anchor that's going to keep us from being moved. He's the anchor that's going to keep us firm in our faith so that we stay in faith and hope and trust, and that we're not moved over to a place of anxiety and fear and dread. So that when bad news comes, we're firm, we're steady, we're supported because we're trusting in the Lord and he is giving us his support. And then it says right after this, his heart is steady, therefore he won't be afraid because his heart is supported by the Lord. His heart is strengthened by the Lord. And then it says, until he looks in triumph on his adversaries. Our adversary right now is not something you can see in one way because it's we have an adversary that's this disease that is this virus, and that's part of our adversaries. But we also have adversaries in that we have an enemy who is seeking to destroy us through the midst of this. And we know in John chapter 10 that Jesus says the enemy comes to steal and kill and destroy. And so he's trying to steal our happiness, our joy, our peace, our contentment. And he's trying to replace that with fear and anxiety and dread and stress and anger. And of course, all of that wrapped up in sin. He's trying to destroy us. But Jesus, in that same passage, says, I have come to give you life and to give it to you abundantly. But that's if we put our faith and our trust in him so that he can support us and keep our hearts strong. It's really cool because there's this other passage in Matthew, and let me turn to that real quick. It's in Matthew chapter 14. You're probably familiar with this story, but the story is Jesus tells his disciples to go on ahead without him and to go across the sea. Jesus stays behind and prays. And while he's praying and the disciples are going across the sea in the boat, a storm comes up. And the boat is hit by a lot of wind. And so they have a significant amount of wind coming against them. And Jesus comes to them and he's walking on the water towards them. You remember the story now. So Jesus comes walking on the water. And as he gets close to them, the disciples are afraid. And they're afraid because they see a man walking on the water, and they don't even think it's a man because no one has ever seen a man walk on the water before. They think it's a ghost. And so they're terrified, Matthew says. And so Jesus has to tell them, take heart. It is I. Also in Greek, it literally says, take heart, it is I am, which is really cool because, if you remember in the Old Testament, I am is the name of God, Yahweh. So Jesus says, take heart, it is I am. That verb in Greek for take heart means to be of good courage. So when you think of, well, how do I take heart? Well, I need to have firmness of heart. My heart needs to be steady. I need to take heart. And so Peter is excited that he sees Jesus, and Peter says, well, if you ask me to come, I'll walk to you on the water. And Jesus tells Peter, okay, well, come. And Peter gets out of the boat, and he starts to walk on the water. And then if you remember, verse 30 says, he saw the wind, and he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cries out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reaches out his hand, takes hold of him, and saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So Peter takes enough heart to get out of the boat. But then what does he do? Is he starts to feel and hear and see the wind, sees probably the waves crashing against him, and he becomes afraid. And in his fear, he loses sight of the one who is strengthening his heart. He loses sight of the one who is supporting him through all of this. He loses sight of Jesus, and he begins to sink and has to cry out, "Lord, I messed up, save me." And Jesus reaches out and he pulls him up and he saves him, and then gives him the rebuke of, why did you doubt? Because what Jesus is saying to him is, why did you doubt me? Why did you take your eyes off of me? And as we're bombarded with news, as we're bombarded with our own fears and anxieties, what the enemy wants us to do is to take our eyes off of Jesus and focus on those fears. Whether that's a fear of contracting the virus and dying, whether it's a fear of losing our job, whether it's a fear of not being able to take care of our families, maybe it's anxiety about what is this world even gonna look like? All those fears want to take us and steal our heart away, to steal the firmness and steadfastness, the steadiness and the courage of our heart. It wants to steal that away. And what Jesus wants us to do is to keep our eyes upon him, because he cares for us. He's going to say, he reaches out and he saves Peter. And then he gets in the boat and he calms the storm, right? There's this one last verse that I want to look at. This is not going to be a long lesson, but in Joshua, 4 times in the first chapter of Joshua, God tells Joshua, be strong and courageous. And then the last one in verse 9, he says, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. Now Joshua is taking over for Moses, one of the greatest leaders in all of human history. And now Joshua has been chosen to follow in his footsteps. We know that's always throughout history, it's always a difficult thing, even if it's a coach following a great coach. When you have a new coach come in who follows a great coach, there's a good chance that new coach is going to have a lot of difficulty because he's going to be constantly compared to the one who was before him. And I'm sure the same was there for Joshua. Plus, Joshua had been commanded to go in and take possession of the land that God was giving the Israelites. That was a big burden upon Joshua's shoulders. And God reminds him over and over again, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be frightened, the ESV says. Don't be dismayed. Why? The second part of verse 9 tells us, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And that's God's promise to us too. Jesus is with us through the Holy Spirit wherever we go. He's not going to leave us. He's not going to forsake us. No matter what our country and our world goes through, if our faith is being supported, backed up, and strengthened by him, if we have our faith and trust in him, he will not leave us. Therefore, we don't need to be afraid because he's with us, because he's giving us his strength and support. And if you have never put your faith and trust in Jesus, let me just encourage you to reach out. Reach out to me. I would be happy to talk to you. I know it's a scary time, and all of us need to have our faith in Jesus, our trust in Jesus, because like Peter, he wants to rescue us. Like Peter, he wants to support us. And like Joshua, he wants to tell us, don't be afraid. I've got this. I'm with you. I hope that you are all doing well. You are being prayed for every day. If you have any specific prayer needs, please reach out to me. I would be happy to pray for whatever it is that you have going on. And just know that God loves you, that God is with you, and be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. God bless.